Okay, good evening. This is the Town of Stonington Mystic River Boathouse Park Implementation Committee. It's a regular meeting. This is a virtual meeting. It's being recorded. Today is Monday, March 1st, 2021 at 6 p.m. I'm Sandy Tashir. I'm recording secretary. And those present are Nicholas Keppel, Catherine Birchinell, I gotta read off the list here. Debbie Downey, Jim Kelly, Mike Crowley, Mike O'Neill, Tom Switz, Tim O'Brien, Chris Gasserick, and I think that's, did I just kill somebody's name? I'm sorry. All right. You can bring the meeting to order unless I forgot somebody.
All right, I'll call the meeting to order. We can start with the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Did we have somebody join us? No.
This is Rick Roberg.
Rick and Fran Hoffman too, Sandy.
Is Rick calling number 6 so I can put his name on here?
Hard to tell for us.
Okay. All right.
So good evening, everybody. Again, unless people are speaking, they should mute their devices. That'll hopefully take care of some of the background noise. We have, I'd entertain a motion to approve the minutes for the February 8th meeting. Is there a motion to approve the minutes?
So make a motion to approve them.
So Mike O'Neill made a motion. I'll consider Tom's to be a second. Any discussion on the minutes? Questions, concerns? Hearing none. All those in favor of approving the minutes of February 8th as submitted to the committee, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion is carried. I believe the only...
Chairman Keppel, did you want us to alternates or anything?
I think we have a quorum, so we will always welcome our alternates and appreciate their participation, but am I right? I think we have a quorum. So
yeah, you do have a quorum.
Yep. So no need to seat any alternates, I don't believe. I think the only correspondence we have is the email that Sandy circulated from John Thornell, which had a nice group of videos. That if people haven't had a chance to review that nice collection of videos, I would encourage you to do so, because they capture the opportunities that are going to be available to park and boathouse users. Under old business, under Brownfield grant application update, the update I have from Susan Cohen this morning is that she and Deb continue to work on completing the application. Susan mentioned that she'd gotten input from several people, questions and comments, and they're working on those. In order to maintain a little bit of competitiveness, the town has opted, and I think it's wise, to not share, basically go public with their final version, because it's, this meeting is recorded, and if they shared it with the committee, it'd be a public document, and then any other potential competitor could get their hands on our application. So I think we've seen it in multiple draft form, so we have a sense of where things are going. If folks have questions, continue to have questions about allocations and what we're seeking, you can talk to Deb or Susan directly. They're heading up the effort. As you recall, I think April 9 is the application deadline, right, Deb? Or thereabouts?
Yeah, thereabouts. I believe so. We're aiming to have it done and ready to go by the end of March. Susan is out on family leave for a week or so, but I'm working kind of while she's away. We're incorporating the comments and edits that we did receive, and so by the time she gets back, we should have something pretty close to done.
Okay, thank you, and Susan, for your continued efforts. I think the project budget update was an earlier question. Unless someone has a pending question, I believe the budget for the assessment grant has pretty much been used up. Is that your understanding, Deb?
Yes, it has been used up. That is correct. We were able to use it all and get quite a bit of information, which has given us kind of a leg up for the remediation grant application.
The Park Management Committee subcommittee did not meet in between the last the February meeting and ours, so there's nothing to report there. I know I'll let you have the floor, Mike, but I know the Rowing Center group is in active dialogue with the town about an MOU, and is planning to share information with the town about money raised thus far and targets, as well as trying to come up with some kind of a document to be able to, so that the town can reference that agreement when it submits in late March. Anything else you wish to add, Mike?
Yeah, I think as you and I have talked about, Nick, we just like to try and formalize our agreement with the town. And up until now, it's been talked about a lot, but it'd be nice to at least get it to the MOU phase where it spells out kind of the relationship of what the town will do, what the rowing center will do as we move forward. So I've been in contact with Danielle, and we'll try and get the documents put together before the next meeting.
Okay. And the only other, on the last item of old business, I would encourage people to just, as time allows, touch base with the Selectman's office about where your appointment stands, so that if the board needs to reappoint anyone, they did a couple of reappointments. Deb, do you have any sense of, are you looking for anyone else to indicate whether they want to be reappointed? Do you recall whether?
I don't recall. I'd have to reach out to Stacy, and I could certainly send you an email or send an email to the committee, but we definitely encourage anyone who's still interested in continuing, if their appointment is about to expire, to send an email to Stacy Haskell.
Very good.
But I haven't seen anything in the past week or so that says we're waiting to hear from so-and-so.
And troublemakers like Tom Switz, the first time we get a chance to kick you to the curb, Tom, we're gonna toss you like a bad suit.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
No good deed gets unpunished around here.
Wife's been telling you that for years.
So the main focus of tonight, I think, is going to be the sharing by Chad of the living shoreline feasibility and the living shoreline site exposure. So, Chad, I think the floor is yours, and we'll hear from Chad about the living shoreline study, and then can ask questions and discuss. And so, the floor is yours, Chad.
All right, I am starting to try to share my screen. So let's see here. There is, which one are you seeing this feasibility study right now?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. All right, excellent. Because there's 4 different ones, and I'm just trying to figure out how I make sure each one gets shown correctly. So we'll go through the feasibility study first. You all should have received copies of it. It's 34 pages. I'm not going to obviously read every page. I'm just going to focus through and hit some of the highlights as we go through it. So the introduction, the background, you pretty much know most of that, the approach of what they used, you know the site. We've talked about Glass Beach, the peninsula, and the Sandy Beach. Those are our 3 main kind of areas. We did do quite a bit of plant research, as you saw back last year when we did the vegetation studies, and then we furthered that through the rest of the year. And what that kind of came out with was this quick little graph, which illustrates which plants grow out there and where we found them elevationally, right? So this is the mean tide low, mean tide high, and the ultra high, and where we find the plants and kind of how they were spread out elevationally. Both this is directly on site, and then this is what we found, from research material, I'll say, as far as salinity and elevation goes. And they were pretty close, which is good to see that the 2 of them correlate. And then we went through the salinity ranges of all those different plants just to see what correlates the best. And as we had talked about before, the one area that kind of concerns us, or the area we're trying to study, is that barren strip of land that's kind of between just above the sea lavender, if you will. And we still haven't necessarily figured that out, but that's the area we're paying attention to, and what this assessment was looking at is what might be causing that. What does tend to grow there, this is the Pennisetum variegatum. That's a picture out on site. And you've seen this. Now, what we have seen is that the Pennisetum has stayed, and we are seeing a little bit more erosion around it, but the root mass is staying intact, which bodes well, because that's one of the plants we want to use kind of right at that tidal range. So if we plant more of it and we get that root mass going, that would indicate that that'd be a good plant to be using all along the shoreline. From animals, we've been talking about oysters from the beginning, and oyster castles. We do have native oysters living out there. So this is a photograph, of some smaller oysters, or more on the juvenile side, but they are out there. There's not a ton of them, but they are there. What's out there more prolifically are the ribbed mussels, and there's a picture down there. Ribbed mussels, and they're growing on everything, in between chunks of the slag, in between bricks, on rocks, and especially within the Spartina right along the coast. And so this is the ribbed mussels right in the root mass of the Spartina, on the rocks and roots on the sandy beach. And so this is going to kind of play into it, where some of our findings came from this as we go forward. Then the engineers looked at all the different physical parameters. Basically, this is kind of all of the forces that get impacted on the beach, and the wave ranges and kind of the classifications. That just boils down into basically kind of the erosion history of the site and the sea level rise, as well as the tide ranges that we get out there. I will say one of the interesting findings that we did get is that the tide ranges here are a little bit bigger than what we found on the actual tide gauges out in New London. The high tide wasn't quite as high, as about 6 inches lower than what we see in New London, but the low tide was significantly lower than what we see in New London. And one of the kind of things that we think might be going on there is this massive fluid dynamics, and we know that the sea's not always level. And just as a river flows downhill, and you get ripples of it based on both the sides and the contours and the widths, but also what's happening underneath the water surface. We were thinking that maybe the Mystic River might actually drain quicker, kind of from this connected fluid dynamics of as the tide's going out of Long Island Sound, and you have all the water exiting Long Island Sound, that as it's exiting, it might almost act as a suction, as a straw, and kind of draw down the river more so than other areas in our region, just because tide gauges right now are looking lower on the low side and not quite as high on the high side. But it's just one of those first findings. And then having a quick email with Chris Kaczorek from the Seaport too. It sounds like they're about to put in a tide gauge at the Seaport with USGS. And so there might be even more information coming, hopefully over a longer period of time, so we can really get to know that. But that was the first kind of interesting thing from a tide range perspective. The waves, we studied the wave buildup of everything. The good news is the waves are small, right? We have a pretty big fetch on the northwest, but because of the smallest or the shallowness of the river in there and the breadth, the waves are actually pretty small when we really look at it. One of the biggest issues is wake, because we actually get bigger waves from wakes than we can from waves. But it is kind of a slow area from a wake perspective. So as long as we can kind of control that, we should be okay. Currents, not crazy currents. So it's not like a typical rushing river. So pretty good things from the currents. Ice became kind of one of the driving factors here. There isn't a long history of the ice. The engineer did do a bunch of different discussions with people around trying to figure out what the history of the ice is, but that, there has been walkable ice 12 inches or thick in living memory, although not a ton of it. And we know we haven't had really thick ice in the last couple of years, but a handful of years ago we did. So, however, the ice does play a pretty significant part when you start thinking about living shorelines and trying to get things to live in that area of ice scour. This is just the storm surges that we've been looking at based on NAV 88, which we all know these are what's been charted. That's why we were putting the boathouse just above elevation 7. At about elevation 8 was the low point, knowing that it was going to have that inundation. We know that the 100-year FEMA flood is to get the building up to elevation 12 or 13, which we're now recommending. And so those just all kind of correlate as it should. These are the summaries of the slope indexes from different cross sections around the site. Just trying to briefly go through it. Offshore depth, we know the river out there is really flat, right? There's the only deep spot is where the channel is. Everything else is pretty shallow, and that also helps with the wave buildup on that long fetch. Sunlight exposure, the remediation, all they did was basically just summarize Fuston O'Neill's findings that we know we have remediation throughout the whole site, and we're going to have to do a 2-foot clean cap over everything, extending down to the mean high water line or a little bit lower than that for public protection. There's a summary here on kind of the state and federal permitting process. We have had initial discussions, I'd say quite a few, with the Land and Water Resource Division through the state. And we've had initial discussions with the Army Corps, bringing them up to speed, and have submitted some preliminary plans to them, really as it comes down to navigation because of how close we are to the federal channel. We're not in the channel, but we're within the setbacks of the channel for review. And so we've had those discussions to kind of prime them. Didn't get any reviews back from them that were massively alarming that we need to be changing anything. So those are good indications. One of the things we have to do is look at alternatives. So when we go to do all the permitting, we have to have the different alternatives that we've done. And so here's the kind of different living shoreline possibilities. And then these are the different forces or criteria that we're dealing with and kind of the chart that everybody uses for if they're appropriate or not. I'm not going to go through all of those different ones. We have talked about them in the past, but basically we want to be dealing with sea level rise. We want to have something that can combat ice. We have the width of both the coastline as well as the overall river. And then the big one's going to be the soil bearing capacity as well. So obviously nothing matches perfectly because it never does, but we looked at a whole bunch of different scenarios. And one of the ones that started to become the best preferred option is this idea of a little bit of a sill, a natural sill out here. This is where we have been talking oyster castles. In the research that we have on one of the other ones on the feasibility study, the oyster castles haven't succeeded well this far north, or much farther north than New Jersey is what I would say. What we've found is that they're using them, when we are using them in New England, they're using them at a lower elevation in the water column, meant to break up the wave energy as bigger waves are coming in, and they're meant to be below the low water mark. Because what happens in New England is we get ice, and the ice comes down and the ice rips the oysters off the top of the rock, or the top of the oyster castle, and it can dislodge the oyster castle as well. So that they work, but they work below the low water line. Here, we need something to be working really between low water and high water in that buffer range, so that as the waters are coming and going, we can break that wave energy before it gets to the shoreline. So the oyster castle itself doesn't appear to be the best choice right now. So what we're actually focusing on is a modified sill that has soils and rock built into it and a substrate to grow the ribbed mussels on it. So as we pointed out in that one photograph, we have ribbed mussels all over the site, and ribbed mussels actually have a symbiotic relationship with that Spartina, in that the waste from the ribbed mussel becomes the fertilizer specifically for the Spartina. The two actually feed off of one another and clean the water and work together. So we're looking to build a substrate where those two species, which we have living onshore or on the coastline already, and expand that and use that as our living breakwater instead of the oyster castles is the current recommendation. And then upward of that, we're looking at an extended marsh and then an upward marsh for marsh migration, right? And so by having a sloped marsh go all the way up, and then we have our toe protection here for the contaminated soils that's buried, because this is the edge of the site. What that allows is for marsh migration, whereas sea level comes up, right now the marsh lives in a very specific elevation range, but we know as sea level goes up 20 inches that this will become submerged and we need a new area for that marsh to grow. And so by doing kind of a sloped marsh the whole way, or a sloped ground plane, we'll plant it with different species, but we expect over time that the Spartina that's growing down here with the mussels will migrate up over time. So we still get the same effect that we've talked about the whole time. We're just looking at it with different plants and different animals to fulfill it. We had to do the alternatives were number one. When you look at it from a permitting perspective, you have to say, okay, what's going to happen if we do nothing? So do nothing is always option number one. Option number two is the bulkhead, which is kind of going the most severe route, so that we can, when we're going through the permitting process, we can say, here's nothing, and here's what you could do. The town could say we want to put in a bulkhead all the way out at the water line and bring grade all the way out and kind of study that. Option three is what's called a stone sill. And this is, you might not be all that familiar with it, but you're going to be seeing a lot more of these around, because this is kind of one of also coastal engineers' new favorite tricks, is to do a rock sill. So out in the waterway, you build a rock sill, kind of like what we're used to seeing as a jetty, but jetties are really big rocks and they're built high enough to be way out of the water by quite a bit. A sill is built just up to the high water line. It's built with smaller rock, and it's meant so that as waves are coming in, they hit this and they break and they lose a lot of energy, and then this becomes shallower water that can sustain more of a natural coastline without the wave energy. I kind of have an issue with it because it's being used as a living shoreline all the time, but it really is just a jetty. It's just a very hard engineered structure, and we want living shorelines to not be these hard engineered structures. And so by putting it out here, yes, our shoreline is living, but we're just moving an armament from the coastline out into the water, is kind of my feeling on the stone sills. But it was one that we looked at, again, how big would it have to be, where would it need to be in order to do the protection of the living shoreline. And level 4 is this level marsh, where we have this tow that we've talked about that's in the water, that's planted, that has the ribbed mussels and the spartina. And then we do a true level marsh behind it, where we just fill in at a level point. This could be dredging spoils from a local project, or it could be imported to fill. And then we have our tow protection. We have our cap covered down here with riprap, and then our regular site. This was something we had looked at originally, right? When we were talking about oyster castles out here, we had a level marsh here. And what came out of this study was that that's good for now, but it might not be great for that, 20 inches of sea level rise, because it's not giving room for that migration. And so alternate 5, which is the preferred method, preferred design at this point, is that simulated marsh tow out here that's planted with the rib mussels and the spartina, and then a sloped floor, ground plane, if you will, that provides a marsh now, has some boulders in it. These larger boulders are kind of set out there. Yes, some people think they look aesthetic, but they're really there to break up the ice. So if we have really big ice sheets that are flowing, as the tide goes up and down and the ice lands on top of them, it breaks the ice pieces apart and allows it to flow around it instead of causing as much damage. And then as that slope continues up into the shoreline, that's what gives us the ability to have that marsh migration over time as sea level comes up. And we still have the same tow protection and everything buried underneath. And this is a choice to intentionally bury it, so that, again, the contaminated soils are out here. We have to ensure that if erosion ever happens, if we ever get that 100-year storm and we have a massive erosion going on, that there is riprap protection for that contaminated soil, so it doesn't become exposed during a massive storm if something out here fails. And that could be up at the surface, but again, the thought was that what we'd been talking about, what the public had really reacted positively to, is more of that full living shoreline where you don't see that riprap on the surface, you don't see that highly engineered edge, and that we can bury that under the ground, still get the same protection, but have a living shoreline growing over the top of it. And so alternate 5 was really where the study kind of pointed to as the best scenario for this particular location. And that's the whole summary of each one, but I basically just did it for you. So that's that one. Let me see if I can. That's feasibility. All right. Are you seeing the waterfront exposure assessment now? Hopefully, yes. All right, good. This is just some of the background data that goes into the living shoreline assessment. So this is what looked at, the true tides, flooding, bathymetry, the salinity, the 100-year, or 10 to 100-year studies. So this was just the background information. Again, the site location, the tide fluctuations that we saw, the flooding elevations. This is the map we've all been now used to seeing for a while from the Connecticut circa, as far as what the sea level rise should be protected. This is a cross section of the entire river, again, as we look at bathymetry and fetches. So this is the actual site. This is the bathymetry of the channel. That's the entire rest of the river going to the west. And then that's the western shore as it comes out of the water on the opposite side. So just looking at the bathymetry of everything out there, the current out there, again, very slow. The salinity, again, that was one of those things that we found a little bit interesting. It was logged out there for about a month, doing 5-minute increments. And the salinity, so this is the salinity graph. For the majority of the time, it was pretty uniform. And we had kind of a rain event, little rain event in here, but everything stayed fairly uniform. We had a little bit bigger 2-day rain event here, and the tide fluctuations, you could see it get a little bit bigger following this rain event, it got a little bigger. This rain event, it got even bigger. And then this one, it was really quite the extreme fluctuation in salinity. More so than Mark, our engineer from First Water, had seen in most places. So it was enough for him to start calling around to other towns, mostly everybody north, so North Stonington and Ledyard, and contacting their public works and saying, hey, is anybody doing a drawdown? Were any dam releases going on? Like there was something upstream, most likely, that was going on that was releasing quite a bit of fresh water. So on the outgoing tides, we'd get a significant amount of fresh water, and then the salinity would come back up as the tide came in. However, after talking to everybody, there was never a reason, right? Nobody ever said, oh yeah, we were doing something, releasing water, but it's just interesting to see that fluctuation that happened. The salinity ranges still support all the life that we're proposing out there. It was just one of those things, the more you look, sometimes the more questions you end up finding. As I mentioned before, ice is kind of the big issue that we're looking at, the vulnerability of the ice, and effectively what it'll have impacts on top of the oysters. And again, just some of his records from talking to the harbor masters and looking at the ice records from around the region. The wind that we've talked about, looking at the wind speeds for the different 100-year storms. These are the charts looking at the graphs, where they're coming from, what the wind speeds are, all that. And of course, that northwest wind is our strongest, highest wind that's going to be coming from the winter storm, and that's going to be coming on the longest fetch. So the wind wave potential, right there's the site. That's those longer fetches, the north-northwest. But as you'll see, when you do the whole wave study, even the north-northwest in a 100-year storm, right, you're getting, an amplitude, a 2-foot wave, which really isn't that big of a wave compared to most coastal environments where you're dealing with really crashing waves all the time. On a 100-year storm, that's not a very big event. So that's good. And then the vessel wake, again, that was a study on what they were looking at as far as height of waves during that, and the risk assessments to go along with them. And so basically the summary is ice becomes the biggest issue, right? That flow of ice, even the current during a massive storm isn't too much in this location. I think it was a 26-mile watershed that drains into the river. Up north of the basically 95 bridge, obviously the currents are going to be much faster. You have that same drainage. It comes into a smaller area, but by the time it comes down here by this site, and the river has opened up so much, the flow is not quite as bad. So really it became ice is the big driver, and the worry with ice is what kind of led us away from the oyster castle specifically, because of the oysters getting sheared off the castles. And so this is, I'll just go through, there's the bathymetry of the site. We've already seen. All right, so that's enough of that. Let's go to, all right, so these should be the plans that we've come up with. Again, planimetrically here, a lot of this looks very similar. You've seen most of it. What we got into was refined design. We got into moving things a couple of feet one way or another. We got into some of the details specifically of how these docks and railings and retaining areas need to work. There's actually needs to be a bulkhead under here, underneath that area between the boardwalk and the land, and how that works, working on the railings and specifically working on the grading and the lighting. So planimetrically, this looks very similar to what you're used to. It's just a lot of minute adjustments. This is the coastal grading plan. So probably a little bit difficult to see here, but you can see we've gone down into the low. We've regraded the site up to that new level. So those are all brand new contours. The grading and the revetment that has to happen underneath the boardwalk in this location. And then the grading that happens around the peninsula, because again, we're going from an elevation 2 up to about an elevation 7. And then the regrading of this whole area to get the boat ramps to work, to allow the float ramp that this gangway can go over it and down to the float. And then the other thing we did look at too, I should mention here, this is a stormwater infiltrator. So subsurface infiltrator that's capable of holding enough stormwater for this. This is not engineered, it's not close to construction ready, but it is sized for the areas so that we have an idea of where we wanted to make sure it can fit. This is just the test to make sure the idea works. And it's located here because our lowest point from a drain is this catch basin here. So we need to make sure we can get water to this basin, get it back into here, and then get the water released out of there into the drain pipe that outflows out. And make sure we don't have a whole lot of elevation to play with to make sure all of that works together nicely. Lighting, we haven't talked about lighting a whole lot yet, but we got into actually specifying lights. This is the photometric rings of all the lights. So we have street lights out here, we have the parking lot lights, we have bollard lights. And then we're recommending a light underneath the railing all the way around the boardwalk or the fishing pier, if you will. That would be a linear LED light on the underside of the railing to light all of this so that you have light out there if it's needed. It's not super bright, would make a nice effect at night. Very similar to the seaports lightings underneath the handrails on the new Thompson building. It doesn't call massive attention like a light does, but it lights the surface where you need to see light. That's just a bunch of soil profile details. I won't go through most of those. These are some of the details where we have granite, concrete grade beams to be able to hold the soil up and retaining walls where we need them in order, especially in here where we have the concrete band up to the boardwalk. Some more typical details. This is a little bit more, here's the boardwalk, here's that wall. You're now looking at it with the bottom of the plan out towards the water. And this is the walkway that goes up back towards the boathouse. So there's just some details in there. This is again, that kind of a same section through here. How does this edge work? How do we get back down to existing grade where the boardwalk is over, making sure soil is retained and all of that. And then from a design perspective, we got into the railings a little bit on those boardwalks and fishing piers. Played with the idea of making that railing actually kind of as an abstract rowing oar, since this is Boathouse Park, to give a little bit of uniqueness to it. So that's what our recommendation is at this point for the railing, and you can see that in a rendering in a minute. Again, more of the details from some of the drainage perspective, the subsurface retention. This gets into, so those are a lot of details. We also started talking about doing some test areas out there with some of the people from Yukon, from Circa, and from Avery Point. And this was looking at obviously what vegetation is out there, and then proposing a bunch of different test locations to do both testings of, let's see if I can zoom in on this. It's probably hard for any of you to see. Right, so this is testing doing oyster bags. So we're talking about how do we do sedimentation, erosion control protection. Do we do oyster bags? What type of fabric do we use to control those oyster bags? The coir log protection. Testing here, you know, if we did a coir log here, this is an existing bed of Spartina, an existing bed of Spartina. If we just provide some wave attenuation protection here, will the Spartina naturally infill, right? So this is, and then another planting test case over here. So we identified a lot of different areas to be able to do plant tests. These are some of the details of how you do them. Both you have cross sections and plan views in order to do a scientific study on what lives where. And the idea is that we have a bunch of plants that we know grow natively here. We put them in rows that go, you know, so we have a test case of how many are across, and then they go up in elevation, and that's kind of the cross section of them. And then we watch them over the course of a year, and we note what lives and what dies, right? And so basically what we're looking for is to get down to within 1/10 of an inch to know what plants live at what elevation on this site. And in the different scenarios, different kind of environments, microenvironments that they're living in. And then this was just testing kind of construction methods for some of that oyster bags in order to do wave attenuation at the toe of the slope. Some of the sections that we're looking at, again, how do we do it? One of the things this one was looking at, is sediment deposition. So we're curious as to how much sediment is in the water column and how much will be deposited. So if we do an oyster bag here and some of the horseshoe shapes that you saw on the plan, this would be a horseshoe shape in plan view, but in cross section, as the waves come in, will they deposit sediment behind it as the water calms and lets out? And then by doing a double row, what happens is it says, okay, at low tide, how much sediment do we get building up versus at high tide? So again, we can prepare or plan for how much sediment we might be able to expect in the real living shoreline over time. And so those was the test cases, and then there's just some of the details. So that's that one. And then last is the design palette, where we were looking at different actual options. So this is kind of the, hopefully what people get interested in a little bit. This is again that oar, right? So kind of a rowing paddle, the oar blade idea that this is Boathouse Park, so that every other railing post would have this kind of structural, this is steel. What type of steel, whether it's galvanized or stainless, is to be determined. But this is the shape. It gives you the fishing pier, so you have the ability to lean on it or put a rod against it. We've rounded it out so it's smooth, and then that slope allows us to run an LED light on the underside of it so that the light can glow out onto the walking surface as we go around. So that's the recommendation for the guardrails. The benches, these are some discussion options. So we have 2 bench locations. The one is up at the, what I'll call the pollinator habitat by the butterfly garden, where the garden club wanted to donate plants. That's up there by the road in that little triangular shape. We have 2 benches located there. And just for discussion's sakes, we want to kind of I'll say a more modern transitional bench, but one with a back or just one without a back. So those are a couple options to look at. And then what we also talked about was out on the pier itself, where we have the wider area. We wanted some benches out there for viewing. And at one point we talked about something like this, where it's kind of a multi-staged custom bench that people could sit up on top, or they could stand on it, and you can look out so that for regattas going on, you're on this more custom shaped bench, but it has a lot of different ways for you to be able to utilize it, which we think is a nice idea. But spatially out there, we think it's going to be hard. We know price-wise, with everything going on, this is going to be the more expensive option. But one of the things we started gravitating towards as we went through it was the idea of using just large timbers. And the idea of maybe working in partnership with a seaport who's very good at making large timbers, and that maybe we can utilize material that might not be suitable for their needs for a particular reason, whether it was checked or who knows what. But we could salvage some of those big timbers, put them on a little bit of a modern plinth or pedestal, and just arrange the timbers as a bench or as, creative seating out on the pier. And those are the ideas behind that. So kind of like that idea and that storytelling that goes along with that idea, and that maybe that's a better solution than a bigger, more expensive custom bench. From a furnishings perspective, is we know we need a bike rack, so a very simple bike rack, a very simple trash can. That's for down the road. And then from a lighting perspective, we have lit bollards at the drop-off area. So this is a nice stainless steel, very simple, a little bit of light, not a huge glare. It's not going to be in your face, but it provides enough light every other one. This is kind of its matching one that's just the unlit version. And then when we go to the pole lights for the parking area and along the streetscape, we're recommending a pretty simple pole and a simple fixture. This fixture is very similar to what we put in at the seaport in front of the Thompson building, and also complementary to what's at Coogan Farm. So if you have this light now at Coogan Farm, down the streetscape in front of Boathouse Park, and then connecting to the seaport, we've kind of created a zone there that will have the same kind of architectural language from a lighting perspective. And then this is the idea of under rail lit LEDs. So the lighting actually is up in the railing, and you're seeing just the glow of the light as it hits the retaining walls underneath of it. Obviously, in our case, we won't have a retaining wall to hit that light, but that glow that you see on the walkway is what we're hoping to get around on the boardwalk or peninsula. And then we have the plant palette. None of these, of course, are chosen. This is for discussion's sake. Here are 5 different options for street trees, a couple different options for the flowering trees that would be appropriate here. The shrub palette that could be appropriate along the top of the edge. Some of the perennials, we don't have much perennial room out there, but basically the pollinator habitat. Some of the ornamental grasses we've talked about using in the parking area, and then some potential ground cover to be used, and then the coastal marsh plants. And this is where we're obviously going to spend probably more of the time is along the whole coastal edge. And so that's the design palette that we're recommending, or at least putting out there at this point for discussion's sake, to go along with the rest of the plans. So with that, I can do questions.
Chad,
What's the
I'm
plan?
sorry,
Chad?
guys, you don't mind me jumping in real quick because I
Yep.
gotta jump off for another call. You brought up the ice, which is my biggest concern for the pilings, for the docks and everything. Do we have any provisions of what we're gonna do for icing events? And you know, I watched my parents' house in the Pawcatuck. A foot of water is all you need to pull those pilings out. Is there anything that we're doing to look at that?
Well, we know if we do it to a full commercial grade marina standard, the pilings with the ice that we're expecting, the ice they should be fine, right? And what we see at the seaport with a lot of their docks, that especially the one dock that goes off in the angle, that is all pile supported, you know, fares well. I won't say it's completely unscathed, but it fares pretty well. And that dock actually goes completely underwater in a significant high tide. So from the pier perspective, I'm pretty confident that with, I'll say, a commercial level built pier, we should be fine from an ice perspective. The ice is really from the scour that's going to happen along the coast is what worries us the most.
Yeah. Chad?
Yep.
Yeah. I have a couple of questions. I don't know how much lighting you're planning to have there or what the discussion about lighting has been before, but if you're talking about impact to the ecosystem, lighting is not a good thing. And I don't know how much, when the discussion is going to happen about how much and when it's allowed to be used. I think those are big issues. And along that same line is the types of plants you use. Natives are, it's really important from many aspects to use natives, and I don't know how many that you are doing, and that makes a very strong statement. That's something that we can be proud of. But I just want to make sure that we're following the guidelines. And the other thing is that what your report is quite sophisticated, but if there were pieces of that you could pull out sort of in the educational piece that we're going to have about living shorelines, something that makes people feel like they can do it too. They couldn't do what you did, but to make it possible and to pique interest in doing that in people's own property. Yeah, that's all. Thanks.
Yep. So I think I can't agree with you more. From a lighting perspective, we are definitely cognizant of it. We know that the park will most likely be closed after sunset. So the lighting is really minimalistic. It's really focused on the parking lot, the streetscape, and then just a little bit of light around the dock itself, so that if somebody's out there, there's enough light that A, it's a little bit safe for them to be there, but B, police driving by will see them, or they'll be able to be seen on the cameras, and then it's a little bit of a safety aspect. And all the lighting is, like I said, instead of it being a highlight where you can see the light source and it is, you know, just takes away from the view, it'll just be down on the walkway itself on the dock. And it is angled inward so that there shouldn't be much light getting out towards the water surface either. But really, we went further than we probably should have at this point, you know, from a thinking down the road perspective, and really wanted to start the discussion. So that the light, you know, we put it out there so that we can start having that discussion, and not really that this is the final answer at all. So from a lighting perspective, that'd be my answer. Natives, I 100% agree with you. We should be doing natives wherever we can. That's what we specified for most of it. There are some trees that are going to be not quite native, but we have that full discussion the whole way forward. And then as far as like how we make this relatable to the everyday person, I agree. This report is not it. This is a very highly detailed, this is an engineering report. And I will honestly say we can easily make it relatable in vignettes, right? When we kind of make almost like an exhibit there where you can see the interpretive sign and you can see the plants and people can understand that. As far as what people can do themselves from a coastline perspective or a shoreline perspective, I don't know yet. Is the problem, because we've had a lot of discussions actually with DEP about how far can people go before they get in trouble, right? Because to do anything on the coast right now, technically you need a permit. You'd have to go to DEP. If you wanted to plant one little plug of something, they want you to have a permit for it because you're changing the coastline, and technically if it's outside of your property, it's below the high tide line, and you need permits. And so we're trying to work with them to kind of come up with a better solution than so it can be something that the average homeowner can use and do. But I know that they're very nervous about it because there is no one solution that fits all, right? When we first started talking about oyster castles, because that was at the time a great option, they have great success, and it was kind of checking all the boxes that we wanted from a very high level. When we look at it at a master plan level, that looked like the best thing. Then we get into the details and really look at the fine nuances and realize, okay, well, the ice flow might not actually be, the oysters will live. They're just going to live lower in the water column than we want them to get the wave energy break. And it still might be worthwhile, and we still think oysters will probably colonize that little sill, but maybe not like we hope they would do to really do wave attenuation. So anyways, when we first talked about that, the amount of phone calls I got in my office of, hey, can I do an oyster castle? When can I do an oyster castle? Like everybody in Stonington wanted their own oyster castle. And it would be very tempting to say, here's your little Lego blocks, go build your own oyster castles, but it might not have worked in most of those scenarios, right? And so that's where I think DEP is very hesitant. They want to encourage everybody to do living shoreline, but they want to discourage the one use or one design fits all approach. So yes, we will make something that definitely people can understand and grasp the bigger concepts of a soft protection for a coastline. But I don't know if it'll be something they can just run home and do themselves, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Plus, friends, my perspective is rather than treating the park as a learning laboratory for people with coastal property, the people with coastal property can go hire Chad or whomever to guide them on what to do. To me, the opportunity of the living shoreline and the boardwalk, and potentially, for subject to further discussion, the house, is to introduce to people and kids especially what is going on. There's this world under the water that's in this ecosystem that people don't understand. My daughter worked for Save the Bay for a couple of years, and she would do classes for kids who lived in Providence, which is on Narragansett Bay, and kids would have seen the water, but they never really experienced what was going on in the water. And so, those are kids, who are living in essentially at least part of it is a coastal community. So there's so much
I agree with you. And I think the design of the walkway and the dock is, you could just lie down on that dock and just hang over and watch the stuff go on. And that's a great opportunity.
Right.
Yeah.
So to the extent that we can have some signage that, when you were talking about the sophistication of the study, part of the challenge, Chad, will be, boiling what's going on with the shelves and the sludge and the oysters to a point, with displays that can the average person unfamiliar with coastal environments, it can be a learning experience. Other questions for Chad or comments?
What's the password?
Oh, I have a question, Chad.
Yep.
Right, so two. So first of all, I'm sorry if I missed this. What's the material that the decking is going to be made out of? For the walkway.
Well, we're assuming at this point that it's Ipe or something along those lines, but that's a decision that really has to be made down the road quite a ways.
So it's not specified right now. Okay.
Correct.
Right. And then the follow-up question is the docks, as you get the docks that are for the boathouse itself, those are something outside the scope of this part?
Correct.
Basically. Okay. So that'll be something that's going to come in a follow-on discussion?
Well, we've had it right now. We've been keeping it as we've been, how do I put this? We've been showing them to have discussions with DEP so that in a perfect world, when we go through permitting, we permit everything at once, both boathouse docks and town docks and all the coastal engineering. That this is just the beginning to that. So we haven't gotten there yet, and we haven't talked about what the specifics are of that boathouse dock or how big it is.
Okay. Well, I'm asking about materials specifically because I've been on a number of boathouse docks myself, and there are different materials that work for different reasons and better ways. And I'm wondering whether or not there's going to be some kind of planning between those two materials may end up being different, and you may want to have them look similar or something. But the materials that work really well for the launching part of the dock are the composite ones, especially ones that have a lot of drainage built into them, or they have all the holes on the material itself, because it works really well when you're close to the water. Because as you know, the boathouse docks are very, very close to the water. They're not raised up, so they always get a lot of junk on them, and they get a lot of bird droppings and things like that on as well. So, and you always have rowers on there in bare feet. So anyway, so I just wanted to know where we were in that process. So there's still time to talk about what those materials are going to be and how they're going to line up with what the actual docks are going to be for the rowers.
Yeah, we're I'll say not even really close there yet, right? This was all living shoreline really was the focus, and not the materials of the docks or any of the details of the docks at all.
Okay, sorry, didn't mean to interrupt.
Nope, perfect.
By chance, is there a password for the WebEx meeting?
A password?
Yeah.
Hang on. Who am I talking to?
It's Brett.
Oh, it's Breck? I'll
Yep.
email you something, okay?
I asked for it a while ago, but no worries.
Oh, I didn't hear you. I'm sorry. I'll get it to you
No
right
worries.
now.
Thank you.
Hey, Breck, the password is 129-161-9071. I beg your pardon. That's the meeting number. Are you with me, Breck?
Yes, I am. What's the password, please?
Password is capital N, capital H like New Hampshire in caps, small m, capital A, capital E, small e, 99, small b, lowercase b, 9 and capital N, as in.
I guess the Russians are trying to get into this meeting, huh?
Yeah, those are to keep the Zoom bombs. Believe me, it's a blessing because I've heard of some meetings that have been Zoom bombed and it's not pretty. So.
No, I've been in meetings where Zoom bombing has happened. It's horrible.
Yeah.
So it's not working. I'll wait for Sandy's email. Thanks, because I probably screwed that up.
All right. Other questions of Rick? One thing you don't have to worry about is not having time because believe me, we're going to have time to sort some of this stuff out. That's the only one of the few upsides of needing to find ways to to raise the money both for the town and the rowing center folks. So time we will have lots of. Other questions or comments about Rick's fascinating work and his colleagues?
So Chad, based on the information you have, how big a deal is scour going to be on that site when we get to the buildings?
when we get to the buildings being scour from, like you're thinking the foundation, so like from an engineering perspective.
Correct.
Well, as you well know, it probably depends a little bit on the engineer who you ask.
Exactly.
My short answer is it shouldn't be terrible, because we're not in a high wave energy zone. However, an engineer playing it safe will definitely say we're still in a flood zone. We're still expecting water to pass through the building, so it's still going to be have wave energy forces against it. So, but my honest answer is I don't think scour should be that big of a deal.
Any other questions or comments for Chad?
Breck, are you in yet?
I am.
All right.
Well, my only quick comment following on to what I said earlier is that I think it's really important that we not lose sight as the park committee of the fact that the Rowing Center is definitely going to do amazing things for active recreation, but I think Chad's reports and his colleagues' reports, just are a window into, how fascinating and dynamic the environment is there, and that we shouldn't underestimate the power of the teaching moments that we can provide through this park, for our school children, for our visitors, because they're not that many. People can sometimes get to beaches, at Misquamicut or wherever, but to get to a place where you can actually be informed about what you're looking at and what's underneath the water, are fairly, basically you're talking about, some state, but the Cape Cod National Seashore, they have a visitor center and they have great signage, but this, even though it's a small piece of property, relatively speaking, it could have a profound effect educationally, and we shouldn't lose sight of that.
Nick, I would just reiterate that and say it's not just for the school kids, it's for us too, right? I mean, I can't, even as a professional who does this all the time, we're still learning all the time, and seeing, we didn't, and I say we in a collective we, scientifically, professionally, we still don't fully understand the relationship between the rib muscles and the Spartina, right? And there's this symbiotic relationship where one's feeding the other, and that feed turns into glue, which locks the two together, right? And that locking together then creates more protection, and then that furthers, the growth of both of those two species. And so by far, we're getting educated, and I think from the people we've talked about that are interested in the study of that, there just hasn't been enough of it yet. And so, we've talked to quite a few people that want to come and do research studies here where they can look at it. So yeah, it's education definitely for the school kids, but for professionals and adults and everybody alike on best management practices going forward. So, and it doesn't, it's nice to talk about expensive details and railings and beautiful things, but you can also look at the really small minutia of a ribbed mussel and a plant growing on the coast. So I think that all of that's very exciting. I agree.
All right. If there's no other questions, we'll move on. I don't think we have any members of the public, right? Sandy, no members of the public?
Not have identified themselves, no.
Any other final comments from the committee?
Is there a schedule on where we are with regards to the permitting process at this moment? And is there a budget for the work set forward in the design?
I can give you my short answer, and that's no. That right now we've completed all of our work and all the money that the town had for the initial assessment grant, really, which we were able to take quite a bit further. That's all been spent, and it had to be spent by the end of last year, if you'll recall. That was when the grant ran out. And until the next round of funding comes up, permitting. We haven't even started talking about when permitting will start, or what that time period. Normally we always say assume a year for the permitting process, but that won't happen until there's funding in place to be able to start that permitting and then do the drawings. That's why we did do these plans. So these are kind of the preliminary plans to be used for that permitting. We made that kind of baby step, if you will, to be able to have the documentation. But there's no schedule yet because we don't know what, it's going to depend on getting that grant, I assume, to start that process.
Yeah, Brett, good question. I think it's important that we all keep in mind that what's happened thus far is the land was purchased, an assessment grant was pursued and secured, and that assessment grant allowed the development of a plan, and then some study work and the beginning of information for permitting, and also obviously the whole process of determining what implications there were about this being a historic and a part of a historic district. Now the town is pursuing a remediation grant to just solve the environmental problems at the site. Meanwhile, the rolling folks are going to strike their agreement with the town and go off raising money for a boathouse on the remediated site. But in between the remediation work and the boathouse, there is a lot of other stuff about the evolution of a park. The master plan shows a conceptual plan, but we don't have the money for the remediation yet. Boathouse folks have significantly made inroads on some of their funding. All this has to happen, and including things like what's going to be the loads of questions that whether Fran or Rick or others have raised tonight very much still need to be sorted out. It's sort of the full employment plan for the Mystic River Park Committee. We'll have lots and lots of things to be talking about over the next year or two, and advocacy to be doing with our fellow citizens about why this can be the fully implemented plan can be so such a powerful and positive thing for the community.
So I guess my question is that I think regardless of the funding stream and whether we receive that money in 8 months or a year, some sort of a plan should be put together with regards to the permitting, the execution of the construction, and ultimately then the opportunity for the boathouse to be constructed. I mean, if that were to be somewhat solidified, regardless of it being plastic, that we could then have something to work with, I think would be helpful for furthering, this process, because it would set up a bunch of predecessors to our goal.
Yeah, that's true, Breck, but the problem is the remediation grant is not going to provide money for permitting, I don't believe. Am I right, Deb?
Not necessarily. It may have some money for permitting. It's not specifically in there, but hopefully it's kind of built into the soft costs, the engineering and the design and things. So we will do permitting as we go along. As soon as we, if we get the remediation grant, we'll start with the environmental part of it and get that part of the permitting done. But you're correct that it doesn't include some of the town permitting.
We have all sorts of EPA and federal permitting that we need to acquire before we can do much of anything. So I was hopeful that we could at least get those bits and pieces, Army Corps, all the other stuff that has to be, gotten. I mean, we have 16 permits that we have to pull. So
Yeah. I believe that some of those are built into your cost estimate, Chad, correct? I mean,
Well, we had, I mean, in our proposal, yes, we do have permitting fees in there. We, at some point, Debbie, we need to go through what your grant is and how you want, I totally agree. What you're getting is a number. How you want to then break up that number and what you spend it on, is somewhat up to your discretion. And then when we do the permitting and obviously the money the town has left over from the bond, and when do you start executing some of that stuff so you can start getting those permits? The preliminary discussions we had, Breck, with Army Corps and with DEP was trying to lump the whole project into one permitting process. Because we do think it's advantageous to permit the coastal remediation along with the environmental remediation, along with the boathouse and the docks and the fill, because what we do expect is that if you were to truly separate them out and do, say, the living shoreline work, they'd be happy to permit the living shoreline. But then as soon as you went to talk about the fill that you need over the environmental cap, they wouldn't enjoy that discussion at all, and they try to minimize that as much as possible. So that's where, the discussions we had were, if they want to break it up, we should try to keep it together as much as possible so that the town can maximize what they're doing to the greatest extent. And I agree, Brett, that the sooner you can do that, the better. But that's a town discussion as far as funding and when that all comes, together. Do you start it sooner or later, or do you wait for the funding to become available first?
do we know what the cost, like a budget for the permitting might be?
Yes, we have that. The cost estimate that we did, our original cost estimate, has numbers in there for all of that permitting.
And so do you have a rough idea of what we're talking about?
Yes, but not off the top of my head right now. And it was in all, you guys should have it too. In the documentation we've given you, all the different cost estimates and some of the proposals. And actually what we just did, like the living shoreline work, was a fraction of that overall permitting. So we gave you the whole permitting number, but because of what was left over on that grant, we scaled everything back and picked and choose what to go after. And that's what we were able to say, okay, the living shoreline, we have enough money to kind of do that feasibility and assessment. And that is related to the environmental stuff, because that's going to be, instead of doing a bulkhead or a revetment, that's going to be our coastal protection for the environmental concerns. And that's how it was able to get paid for that way.
Understood. I was just trying to figure out if we had, anywhere near enough money to be able to start the process. Because we're not going to spend all the money at once. It's going to be spent over a period of 8 months, so that it's incremental. It's not one big check. So
right, but so your grant money has all been spent, so you have no grant money left to spend. You have your bond money left, but of course that's up to the town as to how they want to spend that. And I think the desire, when Susan and I talked about it several months ago, was more of, let's save that money as much as we can for construction. But that's probably a town discussion that, between Susan and Debbie and myself, if needed, we can figure out what that process is and when it should get started.
So I was hopeful that bond money could be replenished by the grant, and if we were to be able to pull the trigger on moving forward with the regulatory.
It definitely is possible. Debbie, I do think in what you guys had sent around, the cost estimate that Susan had done, you definitely are asking for some of the remediation soft costs in that grant. So, but, in theory, Breck, yes, I do believe if you were to do it now, you could replenish that account. But Debbie, maybe that you have a better answer than that.
No, and I don't have numbers off the top of my head, but yes, we were hoping to get some of those. We're looking at just getting the work done, and some of those soft costs were intended to get the permitting at least started, if not completed, so we can get the construction done. Because, we would just like to move ahead and get this work done. So if we get the grant, we will want to move ahead. You know, if we get the grant in June, we'll want to start in July, you know, getting going on it. So
Is there a schedule on the grant commission, or is it the bonding for all this grant work? Has the legislature set a date yet?
yes, the applications are due in early April, and then they have interviews and additional information in May. And I believe it's June, I'm not looking at it right now, that they're going to do the awards. If not June, it's early July, but I believe it's June.
But Beck, I want to make sure everybody's on the same page that the work that Deb is talking about, for which some of which will require permits, is the remediation work.
No, I'm quite clear on that. Without remediation, you can't do anything. So that's the first bit, right? So we need to be able to but that is a long process. It's not, we're going to be 6 months of regulatory before we're going to put a spade in the earth, right? So we've got a lot of things a lot of hurdles to get going. It would be nice to be doing dirt work in the fall as opposed to in the dead of winter. So.
Yeah, Breck, I know Susan and I, again, several months ago had a conversation about, do we start doing the permitting, do we start down that road before the grant comes in, right? So that you can be more shovel ready if the grant comes in. And I think at least at that point, the conversation, or Susan's opinion at that point was that and I feel bad because she's not here to put her side of it, but hopefully she can fill in if I'm misspeaking at all, was that, it would be better to wait and make sure the town was positive that grant, as positive as they could be, that money would be coming back, or the grant would be awarded before they really spent too much more of the money that the town has left from the bond, was kind of the impression that I got. That although, yes, in a perfect world, if you're getting that money, spend what you have now to get as far as you can and then replenish it when the grant comes in. But I think, especially then, at that point, the bond commission hadn't even met yet. We weren't sure when it would meet. So maybe the discussions and things at town hall are changing a little bit now, but that was it several months ago.
So I couldn't agree more, Breck, with your basic point, which is that we approved the plan last spring of the Boathouse Park, and now the bond commission approved the authorized some funding in December. The remediation is being pursued. So we've got, sort of 3 tracks that have to be coordinated: the remediation, the boathouse fundraising and siting and its approvals, and then the rest of the park, and so in the coming months, clearly we need to develop a coordinated, PERT Gantt chart of, how this is all going to come together and how the 16 permits relate to one another. And also, where is the money going to come from for beyond the boathouse and beyond the remediation? There are going to be, significant other costs, and how can we phase the implementation of the outside the remediation and outside the boathouse for the rest of this. But I hope everyone understands. Chad's work is done. He was reporting tonight on one of his, his and his colleagues' last projects, right, Chad? I mean, it's not, until things sort out about that plan, your role, Chad's role is limited, and we're going to be led by, Susan and the planning staff, and our collective efforts.
Yeah, Nick. So collectively, yes, I would agree. Contractually, we've finished what our contract is for. We feel obviously very passionate for the project, so I'm happy to keep showing up, on your monthly meetings. I'm definitely, by all means, I encourage you, the committee, the town, whoever, reach out with questions. We'll be here to help support and answer questions and keep everything moving. We're not the type of office where once the contract's done, I'm just going to drop the ball and wait until you have more money before I talk to you again. I will definitely be here every month and keep offering my advice as best I can, or help giving guidance, whatever it is, or answering questions as they come up. So, you know, contractually, yes, we're done, but I'm happy to be here and help you get through the process as best we can.
So Chad, the documents, unfortunately, that I wasn't able to see because I was trying to get into the meeting, but can we do the remediation with the drawings that we currently have, or do we need to advance the design?
Well, you have, what we looked at tonight was the beginning of the coastal stuff. So it wasn't, you can't get coastal permitting with what we have. But you're quite a bit along the way to get there, and we've had all the preliminary discussions with DEP and Army Corps, so that they know what's going on, and we've kind of been able to get their feedback and incorporate it into the plans. From the environmental remediation standpoint, you know, the wrap was done, all those things were done so that the framework is set, but the official permits have to be, you know, and a lot of the plans are actually pretty close to being done too. They just have to be submitted, you know, in order to get the remediation stuff going.
Okay, so we've got final grades and all that.
We have, along the coastline, what we presented today was you know, permit ready grading for the coastal work. Yes.
Thank you.
Anything else for the good of the order? Hearing no other comments or questions, I'll give one last pause. Any other questions or comments? Hearing none, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
Second.
Tom, did you make a motion to adjourn? Or Mike, did you make a motion to adjourn?
Motion to adjourn, Nikki.
Yeah.
All right. Mike Crowley made a motion and Beth Perkins seconded, for the record. All those in favor of any discussion about the motion to adjourn? Hearing none. All those in favor of adjourning, please signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed? The meeting is adjourned. Thank you all for your time, folks.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Chad. Great job.
Thanks. Thank you, Chad. Yeah.
Thanks, Chad.
Nice job.
Thanks, Chad.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chad.
Thank you.
Thank you as always, Sandy.
Thanks, Sandy.
Good night, everybody. Stop.